Markets don't move because of formulas, they move because of behavior, and time is how we measure that behavior. Every negotiation, every decision, every response to pressure gets recorded in the data. And when you look at it over time, that behavior becomes measurable.
Welcome to ValuTalk, your source for property valuations, real estate insights, and what's really driving the market. And now here's Douglas.
All right, welcome back. In the last episode, we talked about sellers' concessions, not as line item adjustments, but as market behavior. Today, we're going to take the next step and we're going to talk about time. But before we do that, we need to be very clear about the sequence because time adjustments only make sense if you're measuring the right price. So here's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to briefly revisit the concessions analysis from the last episode because that work doesn't live in isolation. Secondly, we're going to apply that concession adjustment before we ever touch time. Then we're going to measure time two ways, once on raw sale prices and once on sale prices adjusted for concessions. After that, we'll use box plots to see how those adjustments actually shift the middle of the market. And then finally, we're going to do a quick contrast using a newer neighborhood to see how a concessions heavy market behaves. All right, let's get out of the office and get into the data. Let's get started by regrounding ourselves. This is the same established neighborhood we've been working with. It's not the new track, not the builder-driven neighborhood. This is the market with variation, individual seller behavior, and negotiated transactions. That matters for everything we're about to look at. All right, this is the same data set we used in the concession episode. Nothing new, same sales, same time period. Before we do anything else though, let's remind ourselves what concession behavior looked like here. Here's the concession histogram from the last episode. Right away, we see that concessions weren't random. We had a meaningful number of sales with no concessions at all, another cluster in the middle, and then a thinner tail stretching to the higher end. That's why the mean was higher than the median. The larger concessions was pulling the average up. And when we look at the box plot, it told us where the market actually lives. 25% of the sales had no concessions. The middle 50% ran from zero all the way up just under 11,000. That tells us concessions exist, but they're uneven, and that unevenness is what matters. So before we ask whether prices are moving over time, we need to ask a more basic question. What prices are we actually measuring? One of the ways we can sanity check that is by looking at how sale prices relate to list prices. This percent difference and ratio here are sale prices versus list price. I'm not doing anything fancy with this. I'm just looking at how spread out pricing behavior actually is. And what this tells us is that negotiation behavior isn't uniform. Some sales are right at list, some are meaningful below, a few are above. That kind of spread is exactly why averages get pulled around. And it's why anchoring to the middle of the market is usually more defensible than anchoring to the extremes. So that analysis of the percentage difference and the ratio of the sold to list price, that doesn't replace the concession analysis. It just helps support it. So when we choose the median of 47.50, we're not guessing. We're anchoring to where most transactions actually behave. We're not trying to capture the edge cases. We're trying to normalize typical behavior. So let's go ahead and apply the concession adjustment of 47.50 to the data that we have already, and we're able to generate a new adjusted sale price. Now we have two prices to work with, the original sale price and the sale price adjusted for concessions. Now we can talk about time. Up to this point, all we've done is make sure we're measuring the right price. We haven't said anything about direction yet. We haven't said anything about rate. We've just removed the negotiated distortion so the signal's a little clearer. Now the question becomes simple. Are prices moving over time? And if they are, at what rate? That's where regression comes in. Let's start with the raw sale prices. All we're going to do here is plot the sale price against a contract date and ask one question. Is there any directional movement? So let's go ahead and load up the sell price versus the contract date. As you can see, there is directional movement. The slope is positive. Prices are increasing. This is market behavior showing up over time, but this includes the concession noise. So let's ask the same question, but use the adjusted prices for concession. The same sales, the same date, the same market. The only difference is we're going to clarify it with the signal. We're going to take the noise out of it from the concessions. Let's see if there's any change now. What we see is important. The market was already moving, and adjusting for concessions doesn't manufacture time. It refines it. The rate changed slightly, but the story stays the same. This tells us something critical about this market. So regression gives us direction, but it doesn't, and tells us whether prices are moving and at what rate, but it doesn't tell us where most of the market operates while that movement is happening. That's where distribution matters, and that's where box plots come in. So what I want to do now is pull up the box plot. What I want to look at is the sold price, and I don't want to look at the extremes. I just want to look at where the middle of the market actually sits. Not the highest sales, not the lowest sales, but where most of the transactions are concentrated. This box plot shows the distribution of all the raw sale prices. But right here is the mean and the median in the middle. This is where most of the transactions are occurring. See our mean and our median sell price. Now, this is on the sold price. Let's run this for the adjusted sell price for concessions. As you're going to see, the mean and the median both have shifted downward slightly. But notice what didn't change. The structure of the market stays intact. The middle moves. The market doesn't break. That's exactly what we wanted to see. So in this established neighborhood, adjusting for concessions clarified the signal, but it didn't change the structure of the market. That's an important result. Now what I want to do is show you a contrast of this neighborhood and going in back to that newer neighborhood that we were working in before. All right, let's move from this established neighborhood down to the newer neighborhood. This is the builder dominant neighborhood, different market, more uniform product, more consistent seller behavior. This is a place where concessions weren't occasional. They were part of how deals were getting done down here. So let's go to the raw data and so just like before, we're working with the same data, actual sales, same time period, nothing new here. What changes, though, is the behavior. When we looked at concessions in this neighborhood, the pattern was very different. They clustered tightly around $7,500. That wasn't a widespread, that was a dominant behavior. And because the value was so consistent, the median gives us a very clear representation of how this market is negotiating. So let's go ahead and add in our concession for this market as well. So we're going to use the same sold price, we're going to use our concessions, and we're going to use that $7,500 concession. And now we end up with an adjusted sale price for concessions as well as the sold price here. So again, before we talk about time, we had to normalize the price. We applied the concession adjustment. Now we're going to ask the same question, same approach as before. Is there a directional movement over time? And does removing the concession distortion change that signal? So now we're going to do the exact same thing we did in the established neighborhood. Same question, same method. We're not going to change the process. We're just going to test whether the behavior changes. So we're going to use the newer neighborhood data. We're going to look at the sold price and the contract date and run that regression. So we can see there's obviously still an upward increase in activity in this market over the 12 months prior, around $38 a day. So let's go ahead and load up the same data, but this time we're going to do it for that adjusted sell price for concession using the $7,500 median concession. So let's run the data. $38.68. So we got barely any changes at all. That's exactly what we should expect, though. When concessions are standardized market behavior, they don't distort time. They're already baked into the pricing. So across two very different neighborhood markets, we're seeing the same thing. Concessions matter, but they don't automatically drive time. What they do tell us is whether the signal needs to be clarified. And that's the key takeaway from this demo. So let's step back into the office and put this all together. All right, back in the office. In this last episode, we talked about concessions as market behavior. In today's episode, we took that next step by talking about time. But this episode wasn't about calculating a time adjustment. It was about making sure we were measuring the right price before we ever try to measure time. We saw that when you adjust for concessions first, time stops being noisy and starts being readable. Sometimes that changes the rate, sometimes it barely changes it at all. Both outcomes tell you something important about how the market is behaving, though. But what matters, though, is the sequence. If you measure time on the wrong price, the math still works, but the interpretation doesn't. So in this episode, we learned how to read time as market behavior. In the next episode, we're going to take that analysis and actually apply the time adjustment. We'll compare that time adjusted price back to both the original sale price and the concessions adjusted sale price from today. And that sale price becomes the baseline as we move into site size, GLA, and other factors. So until next time, I'm Douglas. Stay curious, stay sharp, and always stay focused on value.
ValuTalk is produced by Data Hub Solutions. For tools, insights, and more, visit our website at datahubsolutionsllc.com. Stay informed, stay ahead.